Picture this, it's late at night. You walk into a luxury hotel expecting a relaxing stay, but instead of a warm welcome, you're met with cold, disdainful looks. She is one of the most powerful women in the world, a black billionaire, but at this point, it doesn't matter. The hotel refuses to serve her. The reason? Her skin color. Hear that? That's silence as her rights are violated in front of everyone. What happens next will shock you to the core. Before we continue, it is important for us to know about you. Write in the comments your name and the city from which you are watching this video. You, dear viewers, are our greatest support. Every like, every comment helps us promote this channel and tell stories that are important to hear. We value each of you and never tire of repeating this. So, ready to hear what happens next? Hold on, because it only gets more intense. Enjoy watching. That evening, rain pounded the hotel windows, creating an unsettling atmosphere. The vast lobby was softly illuminated by crystal chandeliers, and a man in a perfectly pressed suit stood at the reception desk. Everything was as if cut out of a brochure: shiny floors, high ceilings, and soft, barely perceptible classical music. But despite the superficial luxury, the air was filled with something much darker, an underlying hatred that was impossible not to feel. When she walked in, dazzling in her elegance and understated grandeur, her presence immediately attracted attention. She was wearing an immaculate black coat, tailored to her figure. Her name was known throughout the world. Her wealth was unshakable, and she was accustomed to doors opening for her without the slightest resistance. But at that moment, her gaze met the porter's, and his face froze. Tension hung in the air. "Good evening," she said stiffly as she approached the reception desk. The man didn't respond immediately. He glanced quickly at her face, then down at her hands, as if he saw not a person but a problem that needed to be solved. "How can I help you?" he finally said coldly. "I have a suite booked." Her voice was calm, but there was a shadow of doubt in her eyes. She saw his face harden, the muscles in his jaw clench. The man glanced quickly at the computer screen and hesitated. Several agonizing seconds passed before he spoke the words that ignited something dark and deeply hidden. "Unfortunately, your number is unavailable." She frowned, but kept her composure. "That's impossible. I booked it myself weeks ago." The man chuckled and, without looking her in the eye, said, "Yes, but we have had some unforeseen circumstances. We cannot accommodate you." Her heart slowed, as if anticipating something worse. She knew that this answer was not a coincidence. She saw in his eyes more than simple indifference. It was cold calculation, a desire to humiliate. "So what are these circumstances?" she asked calmly but firmly, feeling a dark cloud descending on this conversation. The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "The hotel is full, and we cannot offer you decent accommodations. I suggest you try another place." Her blood was boiling, but she remained outwardly unperturbed. "I'm a billionaire. This hotel knows who I am and that I had a reservation in one of your best rooms. You're deliberately refusing to serve me, aren't you?" A moment of silence. The man stared at her, his lips curling into a barely noticeable but creepy smile. "Perhaps your presence does not fit the atmosphere of our establishment," he said quietly, but there was enough venom in his voice to make the air in the lobby freeze. "What?" Her voice trembled slightly with anger that she could no longer contain. "You heard me." His tone became even more contemptuous. He took a step forward, leaning over the counter so that their faces were almost level. "This is no place for your kind." Time stood still. She stood there, feeling the icy needles running across her skin. The moment seemed like an eternity. His words echoed in her head. "People like you." Those words were filled with age-old hatred, passed down from generation to generation, and in that moment she realized that this was no ordinary hotel worker. This was the embodiment of the very system that was created to destroy and humiliate people like her. "This is racism," she said quietly, but with growing fury. The man just shrugged, feigning regret on his face. "I'm sorry you see it that way, but rules are rules." It was getting really cold all around. The customers sitting in the lobby began to watch the scene furtively, some with obvious interest, others with indifference, as if it were a normal situation. No one came up. No one tried to intervene. She felt her hands tremble, but it wasn't the tremor of fear, it was a rage that rose from the depths of her being. She wasn't just a rich woman. She had been through fire, through humiliation, through a fight for her place in a world that had been against her from the start, and now she stood before the embodiment of what she had fought against all her life. You think you can get rid of me that easily? Her voice became sharp, her eyes flashing with cold determination. The man didn't have time to answer when a figure appeared behind him. The hotel manager, a man in an expensive suit with a cold expression on his face, approached the counter, not taking his eyes off her. The hotel manager appeared like a shadow, his steps almost silent, but his presence was authoritative. He was tall, with a frozen expression, as if he was used to deciding everything with a few short words. His gaze slid over her, from her feet to her head, cold and searching, like a man who was deciding not on a person, but on a product. "Is there a problem, madam?" His voice was even, but there was no hint of sincerity in it. He already knew what was going on, already knew that she would not be accommodated. She held her gaze on him, feeling the air thick with not just hostility, but something deeper, something primal, something that could not be hidden behind the shiny surface of this place. "There is a problem," she said, her voice growing colder. "Your hotel is refusing to give me a room I booked in advance. The reasons are painfully obvious." The manager nodded slowly, as if pondering her words, but his eyes were still icy and different. "Unfortunately, as our employee has already informed you, the hotel has encountered unforeseen circumstances. We are unable to offer you accommodation. Perhaps you will find a suitable place in another hotel." He took a step closer, his tone becoming subtly menacing, like the roar of a predator ready to attack. "You understand that the conditions here are not suitable for everyone. We value our reputation highly." He said the last words with such coldness that goosebumps ran down her spine. She narrowed her eyes slightly, feeling the atmosphere around her grow heavier, as if the walls were closing in, trying to crush her. She knew that look, knew that tone. They used that same tone in school staff rooms, in business lounges and directors' offices, always that undercurrent of disdain, always that sense that she was different, that she shouldn't be here. But today was different. "You don't know who you're talking to." Her voice hardened, and there was a power in it that came from years of struggle and victory. "My reputation speaks for me, and it will tear your establishment to shreds if you continue." The manager sighed slowly, as if he was tired of her words, and crossed his arms over his chest. "Let's not make a drama out of this." His lips curled into a sardonic smile, and he looked around, as if checking how much attention the scene had attracted. The people in the lobby were still pretending to be busy, scrolling through their phones, talking to each other, but everyone was watching the unfolding situation out of the corner of their eye. Some thought it was a common occurrence at such a high-class hotel, an unexpected hit that the manager was trying to smooth over, but others, those who felt the hidden truth under their skin, began to realize what was happening, but no one moved. No one dared to stand up for her. "Drama? You call racism drama?" Her voice was now loud and clear throughout the lobby. She stood tall, not giving anyone a chance to break down. "Your employee told me outright that my presence here was inappropriate. Well, I'm sorry that my skin color doesn't match your expectations, but I'm not leaving. You're going to renounce your lies right now." Her words echoed in the hall, building up the excitement among those present. Some customers were becoming uncomfortable, fidgeting in their seats, but still no one dared to stand up. The atmosphere was tense, like strings stretched to the limit. The manager narrowed his eyes. Something dark flashed in his gaze, as if he had finally dropped the mask of politeness. "You think anyone will be on your side?" His tone was almost a whisper, but each word sounded like a poisonous sting. "In this city? In this place? You think that with your status you can change anything? You think that money will make you equal?" Her heart began to beat faster, but not from fear, from anger. She took a step forward, almost touching him with her gaze. "Not equal," she said, her voice steely again. "Better." He just smirked, but there was a hint of nervousness in his smile. He hadn't expected such a rebuff. "Get out of here," he hissed, clenching his fists, "or I'll call the police." Police. The word echoed through her mind. She knew what could happen if things got out of hand. Stories of other black people in similar situations flashed before her eyes. Stories that ended in tragedy. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for anyone who might be in her shoes. Her breath quickened as the word police came out of the manager's mouth. It hung in the air like a knife, ready to plunge into her back. She knew it wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. A promise that too many black people had heard and experienced. She could see how it would play out. The police would come in, no questions asked. She, despite her status and accomplishments, would be just another victim of a system that valued her life less than the prejudices of others. But she did not allow fear to take hold of her. She stood firm, despite the tension rolling in from all sides. The manager took a few steps back and exchanged glances with the porter who had been treating her with disdain. Their eyes said one thing: we know what we are doing. They had no doubts about their superiority, no fear of consequences, because, as they believed, consequences only affected those they considered below. Are you going to call the police? Her voice was icy. She said it loudly, for everyone around her to hear. Are you going to call the police on a woman who's simply demanding what's rightfully hers? Or are you so concerned about the color of my skin that you think I'm a threat? The manager froze, looking at her with a new dose of irritation. He certainly hadn't expected her to dare speak so loudly. His plan had been to make her humble herself and leave, humiliated and silent, like thousands of others before her. But now she was noticed. The whispers around her grew louder, and several people who had been sitting to the side began to exchange uncertain glances. She looked at their faces. She saw their gazes darting between fear and interest, between the desire to help and the fear of the consequences. No one dared to come closer, but the tension was becoming unbearable. You think the police will be on your side? She continued, glaring at the manager. Because you're used to people your color always being right? You think I'm the problem? Have you ever considered that you're the problem? The man grimaced, his face turning red. He didn't like how the situation was getting out of control. He took a step forward, his voice ringing with anger. You have no right to accuse us of racism. This is your mentality, your biased perception. We are a high-class hotel. We choose who we serve. And now I am telling you that you must leave. She didn't move. Her feet seemed to have grown into the floor. But inside, the storm of rage was growing with each passing second. A high-class hotel, his words were soaked in arrogance, and she felt that for people like him, her achievements and her status meant nothing. To them, she was just another out-of-place figure in their world of luxury and privilege. I'm not leaving, she said quietly, but there was more power in her voice than in her scream. And you will be held accountable for every word you say, for every action you take. I will be the one who makes you pay for this vile, cowardly racism. The manager suddenly stopped, realizing that his usual methods were not working. He was used to people, especially those who had faced discrimination, quitting under pressure, leaving behind only the bitterness of defeat. But she was different. She did not break. His confidence cracked, but his anger prevailed. You're just looking for a reason to cause a scandal, he blurted out, but his voice was no longer as firm as before. He glanced at the porter again, who nodded as if giving silent support. We don't have to tolerate such accusations. With these words, the manager took out his phone and quickly dialed a number. His fingers were shaking with rage and nervousness, but he was determined to end this conflict in his own way. The porter standing next to him only grinned grimly, enjoying what was happening. As the man began to speak to the police operator, she felt her heart beat even faster. Stories played in her head, endless tales of police treating black people unfairly, of small situations escalating into tragedies. She knew that calling the police could mean more than just a conflict, but something far more dangerous. But she didn't back down. She stood there like a fortress, invisible to those who were used to breaking people. Her resolve grew even stronger when she saw some people in the lobby start to get up from their seats, looking around, trying to figure out what to do. There was silence all around, broken only by muffled whispers and the sound of rain outside the windows. Let the police come, she said confidently. But remember, when this story gets out in the media, when everyone knows what this hotel did, you will be the ones on your knees begging for forgiveness. Her words echoed throughout the lobby. Some of those who had previously looked away became uncomfortable. An elderly couple sitting near the reception desk exchanged glances. A young woman holding a suitcase tentatively approached to hear what was going on. The atmosphere was getting tense. The manager looked at her with disdain, but there was concern in his eyes. He knew that this situation was beyond the scope of a normal incident. He knew that this scandal could become something more than just a showdown in the hotel lobby. When the manager finished talking to the police operator, his face became even more stern. He lowered the phone and commanded, "The police are already on their way. I'm sure they will quickly deal with you." The words hung in the air like a leaden cloud. In that moment, she felt her heart skip a beat as images began to form in her head. Images that would haunt her even in the darkest corners of her mind. She remembered the faces she had seen on the news, black men and women who had been unfairly detained, bullied, and humiliated simply for being who they were. She knew that her situation was no different from theirs, despite her status, despite her wealth. She could be one of them. Through the silence that had fallen in the lobby, the sound of sirens began to sound, distant at first, but closer with each passing moment. She felt the tension rising, the air growing thick with fear. She looked around at the people around her, saw how some were still trying to distance themselves from what was happening, as if they didn't want to be a part of this story, but she knew she had to fight, and her fight wasn't just about her. "Why are you doing this?" she asked the manager, his eyes blazing with anger. "Why can't you just serve me properly?" "Because," he replied, as if it were obvious, "you shouldn't be here. Your presence is causing trouble, and we can't risk our reputation for one person." Every word he said, every contemptuous remark he made, deepened her sense of fear. Mixed with anger, she felt a wave run through her body. This wasn't just prejudice, this was the real racism she had seen along the way. "You don't understand what this looks like from the outside," she said, taking a step toward him. "This isn't just a denial of service. This is the darkness you're throwing not just me into, but everyone who feels humiliated by your attitude." But his expression remained impassive. "Do you think any of them will raise their voices for you? This is not your fight. It is mine." The siren was getting closer, and fear began to build in her chest. She could imagine the police entering the building and asking what had happened. She knew they could just see her, a black woman in an elegant dress, and immediately assume she was guilty. And at that moment, when her nerves were at their limit, she turned to those around her. "Can any of you support me? Can any of you tell me that this is wrong?" A few moments of silence filled the air. A couple of older people by the door looked upset, but no one dared to stand up. The young woman with the suitcase shook her head, her eyes full of worry, but she remained where she was. Only one person, a man in a gray sweater, finally stepped forward. His face was serious. "This is not right," he said, looking at the manager. "You can't just treat her like that. This is not the way things are." The manager turned, his face contorted with rage. "You should remember who's boss here," he snapped, his voice growing menacing. "Master," the boy said through clenched teeth. "Master, do you think you have the right to decide who is worthy of respect and who is not?" At that moment, the sound of sirens filled the lobby and the hotel doors burst open. A group of police officers entered, and her heart sank. She knew that this moment would determine her future. They could see her as a victim or a threat. The police quickly scanned the premises, and one of them, a tall, stern-faced man, walked up to the manager. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice stern. "This woman is disruptive," the manager said quickly, pointing at her. "She refuses to leave our establishment and is threatening our staff." Her throat tightened with fear. She had already seen how the situation had turned out. She knew this was only the beginning. "It's a lie," she cried, her voice desperate. "I came here like any other customer, and I was humiliated because of the color of my skin. They don't want to serve me, and now they're trying to make me feel guilty." The policeman exchanged glances, and the one in front leaned slightly toward her. "This is no time for emotion," he said, and her heart sank. "Come with us." "Where?" Her voice trembled with fear as she felt everything around her begin to fall apart. She saw the manager looking at what was happening with satisfaction, as if he had received full rights to her life and freedom. "Just talk," the policeman said, but she sensed danger behind those words. She looked around at the people who were still watching the situation and realized that now it was all up to her. Her rage became her strength. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't leave without showing the truth. "You all heard," she screamed. "You know this is wrong. This is not just an incident. This is racism in its purest form. Don't let them get away with this lie." In that moment, it became clear to her, this wasn't just her fight. This was a fight for everyone who had suffered such injustice. Her words, full of pain and passion, echoed around the room, and she could see the fear slowly turning to determination in the eyes of those around her. This could be the start of something bigger, a movement against hatred and prejudice. But suddenly one of the policemen turned to the manager and asked, "Do you have documents for this woman?" For a moment her heart sank as she realized that her fate could depend on every word the manager said, every lie he told. The policeman's words were like a death sentence, and an awkward silence hung in the air. Her heart was pounding as if it was trying to escape her chest. She knew there was a threat in those words. If the police believed the manager, if they decided her accusations were baseless, things could end terribly. The manager, feeling that power was returning to him, smiled slightly, confidence flashing in his eyes. He stepped forward, looking around the lobby as if seeking support from those present. "There, you see, not only is she disturbing the peace, but she is threatening us," he said, his voice growing louder and more aggressive. "You don't have to let her stay here, just arrest her." She felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Her voice trembled as she exclaimed, "I did not break the law. I just came to this hotel like any other customer. I do not deserve this humiliation." Several more officers joined the police officers, and their gazes became focused. One of them, a tall man with a short haircut, began asking questions of the manager, while the other, with a wary expression on his face, continued to watch her. "What do you mean she's threatening you?" the policeman asked. His tone was stern, and it gave her confidence, even though fear still gnawed at her soul. "She's just saying that her skin color shouldn't interfere with her rights," the manager replied, cutting her off. "She's here to cause trouble, not to enjoy her stay. All she does is humiliate us in our hotel." She felt his words like sharp thorns piercing her soul. He accused her of being the cause of the conflict, and in that moment all eyes turned to her again. She knew she couldn't back down. "You don't understand," she screamed, her voice shaking with tension. "I'm not here to put anyone down. I'm here to prove that we black people have the right to the same respect and consideration as everyone else." The policemen exchanged glances, but they couldn't ignore the manager. They stood before her like two walls between which her life could be crushed. "We need to verify your identity," the policeman said with a hard expression. She felt her hatred boiling up for this system that had left her so often defenseless. With every word the manager said, her humiliation snowballed. "Why don't you just leave?" the manager said with a sly smile. "Or do you need your servants to come for you? I'm sure they're already rushing to their mistress's aid." He said this with such smug confidence that several customers in the lobby, who had been watching the altercation, began to exchange glances. She knew that their silence meant that they agreed with the manager, that they, too, shared his biased opinion. "Look at her," he continued, turning to the police. "This is typical behavior, trying to portray herself as a victim in order to get privileges that she is not entitled to. You know how it is with people like that. They are always looking for an opportunity to steal something, to take something from normal people." The manager's words cut into her soul, and she felt the blush of shame creep up her face. Every statement he made was an insult to her dignity, every drop of poison that left her further humiliated. She knew she had to fight for the truth, but in this heartless place, surrounded by prejudice and hatred, her fight seemed futile. "I'm not a thief," she said, gritting her teeth to keep from crying. "I'm a woman who built her life and business, and I deserve respect. I'm a billionaire, but even money can't protect me from your racism." The policeman just looked at her with disbelief, his expression saying that he didn't want to believe her words. "Where are your documents? Can you back up your words?" he asked, and her heart sank again. She pulled out her phone, her hands shaking as she searched for confirmation of her identity. At that point, the manager intervened again. "She's just trying to make noise. Make sure you detain her until we find out who she really is." With each passing second, her fear grew like waves in a stormy sea. She knew that if they decided she didn't deserve to be here, her whole life could turn into a disaster. She felt her voice take on anger again. "You must know that this time I will not go away quietly. I will tell everyone what is happening here." The policemen exchanged glances, but the manager was not going to back down. He continued to press, as if her humiliation was his only weapon. "How dare you talk to us like that? We have the right to defend ourselves from any threat." Tears began to form in her eyes, and she knew she had to stay in control. Everything around her seemed painfully familiar, the endless stories she had encountered throughout her life. She felt again the strength of those around her, those who knew what was happening but did not dare speak up. "This isn't just my fight," she shouted, her voice echoing throughout the lobby. "This is the fight of all of us who have experienced racism and bias. I'm not alone." Her words penetrated the hearts of the people around her, and she saw some slowly approaching, as if ready to support her in this mad battle. But then, suddenly, a loud voice rang out from the crowd. "This is simply not fair. You should go, not her. She has a right to be here." The scream was an unexpected spark, and the tension in the air exploded. But the manager, unwilling to give in, shouted, "Don't let them intimidate you. This is just an attempt to create problems in our hotel." Soon she felt a stream of support begin to flow towards her. Her heart pounded in unison with hope, but fear still continued to torment her. She knew that not only her name was at stake, but also the future of everyone who found themselves in a similar situation. The shouts in the lobby grew louder, mixing with the sirens that were getting closer and closer to the hotel. She felt her nerves on edge, the tension filling the room. With every word the manager said, her humiliation became more obvious, as if a storm were gathering above her. "You all see what she is," he continued, pointing his finger at her as if she were something dirty. "She doesn't deserve any attention. She just wants to create trouble to attract attention to herself." The manager came closer, his face twisted with hatred. "Why are you all standing here? Why don't you support your owner? This is our hotel, and we don't want people like her here." People began to move around her, and she felt the eyes of disapproval. A feeling of shame washed over her like a wave. Her hands shook as she tried to gather her thoughts to fight back, but every word the manager said shook her confidence like a bell tolling in an hour of trouble. "I'm here to spend my money and enjoy life," she screamed, trying to drown out his voice. "Why can't you just do your job?" Her cry sounded like a last ray of hope. She turned to those around her. "Don't let him humiliate me. Don't let him humiliate you." But her words seemed increasingly helpless when the manager began to laugh. "You think your money matters?" he said with disdain, his face suddenly becoming even more sullen. "In fact, it only makes your situation worse. You are a black woman, and in this world, that means you must be inferior. Get out of here before I decide to call security." The manager's words pierced her heart like sharp knives, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that his humiliation could turn into not only verbal abuse, but also physical violence. Suddenly, from somewhere in the crowd, a cry was heard. "Why are you doing this? Why are you humiliating her just because of the color of her skin?" But the manager, as if it were his calling, replied, "She doesn't deserve any protection. You all know that she just wants attention. She's nothing but a burden." Her legs felt heavy and she felt fear fill her as the police officers began to approach. One of them, the tall, hard-faced one, looked at her with distrust. "You need to calm down. You're in danger," he said, but her soul screamed, "Danger? I'm in danger only because of you." She looked around, at the people who had once been passers-by. Now they were witnesses. Some began filming everything on their phones, and hope appeared in her heart. Maybe this would be proof. Maybe this would stop this absurdity. "Film this," she screamed, her voice full of passion. "Film this while I can still talk. Show them this is real. I'm not alone. I'm not alone." But the manager, realizing that all this could turn against him, turned sharply to the police. "They are breaking the rules. You must remove these phones. They are intimidating us." Her fear began to turn into despair. She knew that if the police decided to support the manager, her life could change forever. As if this was her final warning, she turned to them. "Please, you have to understand that this is not just a hotel situation. This is a problem that we all have to solve." But no one paid attention to her. The police began to approach, and the manager whispered something in their ear. She felt her nerves being torn apart. The fear became real, tangible, and she knew that her words could be her last. Suddenly, one of the policemen, the one with the short haircut, approached her. "You need to calm down and just leave this place," he said, and there was a threat in his voice. She realized with horror that this might not end as she had hoped. "I can't just leave," she whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "I can't leave this unanswered. It's not right." At that moment, the manager, feeling victorious, approached her, his face threateningly close. "You don't understand where you've ended up. You're nobody here. You're not worth pitying, and you're not going to get anything here." With his last words, he pushed her, and she felt herself lose her balance. She fell to the floor, and at that moment, a laughter that cut her ears rang out in the lobby. It was full of malice and hatred, and she realized that this was not just her fall, it was the fall of her dignity, her hope and faith in justice. "You see," said the manager, turning to the policeman, "she is humiliating herself. Take her away if you don't want her to disgrace us all." Her world was crumbling, and with each passing moment she felt more and more isolated, as if she were trapped in a cage of hatred. The police came closer, and she stood up, gasping with fear. Her body was shaking, and her heart was pounding as if it wanted to break out. "You can't just do this to me," she cried, her voice loud but with an echo of doubt inside her. "I demand respect. but her words had no power. The police continued to look at her with distrust, and the manager stood next to her, smiling confidently. He knew that he had power, and everything that was happening only confirmed his position. "I'll call security," one of the officers said, and her heart stopped. "It looks like you need to leave." She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she couldn't let them. She had been humiliated. She had been persecuted, but she knew that her voice could be heard, even if it was her last fight. In that moment, it became clear to her that she was not alone. She was fighting not only for herself, but for everyone who had suffered similar humiliation. She pulled herself together, summoned all her strength, and looked defiantly at the manager. "You cannot break me," she said firmly. "I will return, and I will tell my story to everyone." And then, even when her strength was waning, she knew that this was not the end. This was the beginning of the fight, the beginning of her path to truth, to justice. She could not leave silently. She had to find a way to win, even if this victory seemed unattainable. She stood there, her arms wrapped around herself as if that would protect her from all the hatred that was growing around her. Thoughts were spinning in her head. How is this possible? How in this seemingly progressive world, racism still exists, especially in such an expensive and prestigious hotel? She couldn't believe that even here, in the midst of luxury and wealth, she had to face this abyss of prejudice again. She remembered how, years ago, when she had started out, she had believed that success and money could free her from prejudice, that their influence would help break down the walls built by hatred and fear. She thought that wealth would give her the power to change people's perceptions, to make the world a better place. But now, standing in this lobby, she realized that all her dreams had collapsed like a house of cards. The manager, feeling his power, continued to press. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he said, smiling with obvious contempt. "You're just an incident here that we want to forget. If you knew how many people in this hotel support me, you'd think twice about your behavior." The people around her began to whisper again, and it seemed to her that their gazes were full of condemnation. She felt her knees buckling, but her pride did not allow her to fall. She raised her head despite her wavering emotions and met the gaze of one of the policemen who stood next to the manager. "How can you ignore this?" she exclaimed, breaking the silence that hung in the air. "I'm just a customer, and even if I'm a black woman, it shouldn't matter. We have equal rights." The policeman looked at her, and something like understanding flashed in his eyes, but he quickly looked away. It was painful, like a blow to the heart. In that moment, she realized that even those who were supposed to protect her might be biased. She felt like everything around her was caught in some kind of web of hatred that was already part of the situation. Gathering her strength, she addressed the crowd again. "You all stand here and watch me get humiliated and do nothing." Her voice was so furious that it echoed in every corner. "I am a self-made woman and you need to support me. This isn't just my fight, it's yours too." A few people began to stir, some shaking their heads in agreement, but most remained silent, as if her words did not apply to them. It broke her heart to realize that they might not be ready to take a stand against the system that surrounded them. The manager, feeling that he was losing control of the situation, tried to raise his voice again. "Do you really think you have the right to be here?" he said, pointing at her with disdain. "You must understand that your money cannot erase the hatred you inspire." "I can't believe there's still such racism in our world," she shouted, her voice shaking with anger. "Don't you understand how humiliating this is? I came here to enjoy my vacation, not to be attacked because of the color of my skin. I thought society had changed, that we were progressing, but now I see that it's all just an illusion." At that moment, one of the spectators standing nearby finally broke the silence. "She's right," he said, his voice confident. "We all have to support her here. It's not right that she's being treated like this." Despite his words, the manager only chuckled. "Well, if you want to interfere, you should think about how it will reflect on you," he said with a grim smile. "This is simply unacceptable in our hotel." But now, those in the audience who weren't afraid to speak their minds began to appear. One by one, they began to show their support, and she felt a fire ignite inside her. But that didn't save her from continued humiliation. The police officers, still standing nearby, continued to watch her with disbelief. She felt her strength beginning to fade, but at that moment her inner voice screamed, "You can't give up. You have to fight." "Look," she said to the police, her voice full of confidence, "I didn't break the law. I just came here like anyone else to enjoy the moment. Why are you letting this happen?" Why didn't you stand up for what's right?" But instead of the expected support, the police seemed to retreat even further. They exchanged glances, and she realized that they did not intend to intervene. It was another display of bias that she could never imagine in modern society. Hope for justice was fading, and her heart was filled with despair again. She could not believe that even in such a prestigious place, where it would seem that everyone should be equal, she was humiliated only because of her skin color. And at that moment, when the whole atmosphere was becoming more and more tense, she noticed how some people began to turn away, to walk away, as if they did not want to be part of this conflict. It was like a cold shower, and she felt how her anger and fear began to intertwine, like the waves of a raging ocean. But the will to fight still burned within her. Even as the darkness grew around her, she knew she couldn't change the world alone, but this fight was hers, and even if her voice was not heard today, she would continue to fight for rights, for respect, to be the woman she was: strong, independent, and unbroken. At that moment, she decided her story had to be heard. She couldn't let this humiliation go unanswered. She knew that not only her name was at stake, but also the lives of those who might one day face the same. She had to keep fighting, despite all the hatred she felt. Gathering all her strength, she looked at the people around her and said, "Each of you can be a witness to this terrible injustice. Each of you can be the one to stand up to prevent this from ever happening again. This isn't just my fight, it's yours. It's our common fight." Despite the words of encouragement, many still stood there, spellbound, unsure of what to do. Several people who had previously shown support began to whisper among themselves, as if searching for courage, and the manager, feeling that he was losing control of the situation, tried to intimidate her again. "You have no right to this agitation," he shouted. "Get out of here before I call security." His threat cut through the air like a cold knife, and she felt fear creeping up on her again, but she knew she couldn't give in, couldn't afford to show weakness. "I won't leave until I get justice," she shouted, her voice full of confidence. "I won't stay silent." At that moment, one of the spectators, a middle-aged man with a kind face, stepped forward. "This woman is right," he said loudly. "We can't let this continue. We have to support her and support each other." His words shook the atmosphere, and several other people began to cheer him on, casting displeased glances at the manager. She felt her confidence grow as she saw others begin to speak up as well. But the manager, seeing how the situation was starting to get out of hand, picked up his phone. "I'll call security and they'll deal with you," he said, his face red with rage. "You shouldn't have come here." She looked at him with disdain. "You don't like me being here? That's your bias, and I won't back down." But the fear she felt was all-encompassing. She knew that the guards could show up at any moment and not know the whole truth. If they sided with the manager, it could be a disaster for her. Still, a spark of hope ignited within her as people began to rally, to unite their voices. "We support her," someone from the crowd exclaimed. "No one has the right to humiliate us." But even as her confidence grew, she could feel the darkness gathering around them. The sirens were getting closer, and the fear was becoming more real. "You can't just silence us," she continued, looking out at the crowd. "We have to raise this issue. We have to talk about it before it's too late." The manager stepped closer, his face filled with contempt. "You think your screams will change anything?" he said with a frown. "You're just disgracing yourself." But her confidence still kept her afloat. "I'm not embarrassing myself. I'm showing everyone that racism has no place in our society. I'm doing this for all of us." At that moment, security appeared and her heart sank. Two large men with stern faces entered the lobby. Their expressions did not bode well. "What's going on here?" one of them said, looking at the crowd. "Why are you all gathering here? This woman is being humiliated simply because of the color of her skin," the middle-aged man shouted, his voice full of determination. "It's not just wrong, it's unacceptable." The guards looked at the manager and she felt her hope begin to melt away like snow in the spring sun. "You are all breaking the rules and I strongly recommend you leave this place," one of the guards said, his voice cold and merciless. She looked at the guard and, overcoming her fear, said, "I didn't break any rules. I just came to this hotel like any other person. Why are you allowing this to happen? Why can't you see that this is wrong?" The guard just chuckled, and the manager came closer to them. "See, she's just trying to cause trouble. I warned you, she's not the type to follow the rules." She felt her voice begin to shake, but she still tried to speak confidently. "I'm not the problem. I'm the victim. I came here to enjoy my vacation. not to be attacked and humiliated. Luckily, several people in the crowd began to support her words, raising their voices and drawing the attention of the security guards to what was happening. One of them, a young guy with cameras, shouted, "Do you see what's happening? We can't stand by and watch this." But the guards just looked at them with indifference. Anxiety flared inside her. She knew that their lack of willingness to intervene could spell disaster for her, but she couldn't let this go unanswered. She decided that she had to use this moment to show that she wasn't alone. "I know this can be scary," she said, addressing the crowd, "but we can't let this continue. We have to unite, and each of us has to stand up against hate. This isn't just my fight, it's our fight." Her words seemed to inspire some of them, and they began to come closer, gathering around her. She felt a surge of confidence flow through her. "If we all come together, we can change this. We can show that racism has no place in our society." A few people started filming everything on their phones, and she knew it would help her voice reach more people. Hate couldn't win if they all spoke together. "We are here to show that we will not tolerate this kind of behavior," one of the men shouted, raising his fist. "We are for freedom and equality." But the manager, not wanting to let the situation get out of control, raised his voice again. "You are simply disgracing this hotel with your shouting. This is unacceptable." Gathering all her strength, she looked at the manager with a defiant look. "I am bringing shame to this hotel. You are the one bringing shame to it with your racism and prejudice, and we must all fight against this." The guards, seeing that the situation was becoming increasingly tense, tried to intervene again. "If you all don't disperse, we'll be forced to call for reinforcements." Her heart began to beat faster, but fear was no longer the dominant emotion she felt. She knew that they might not be able to change the world today, but each of them could be a part of the change. "This is our moment," she cried, her voice powerful. "If we don't fight for our rights, who will? If we don't speak up, who will listen? We must speak up, even if the fear becomes too great." And in that moment, as the sirens grew closer, as fear gripped her heart, she knew this wasn't the end. This was the beginning of how people had to stand up and speak out against hate, the beginning of how she had to keep fighting until there was no room for prejudice and racism in this world. The situation in the hotel was heating up like the air before a storm. The stone-faced guards began to deal with those who spoke out against the manager. "You all need to get out. This is private property and we will not tolerate disorder," one of the guards shouted, his voice sounding like a threat, and it could not help but cause fear in most of those present. The woman felt her heart beat faster, but she knew she couldn't back down. She turned to the crowd, their eyes filled with fear, but also anger. "Look how they're intimidating us," she said, her voice like thunder. "They think they can just throw us away like trash, but we can't let them do that." But the manager, noticing that the situation was getting out of control, looked at the security guards and said, "If you don't disperse, I will be forced to call the police and accuse you of rioting." The crowd froze, and at that moment the woman felt terror fill her. She knew that the police were not trusted in this city, especially when it came to racial issues. She could not allow herself to be alone in this nightmare. "Please, don't let them intimidate you," she screamed. "We must be united. We must show them that they cannot humiliate us." Some began to whisper, "She's right," but others, trembling with fear, began to retreat. Her voice began to sound more and more uncertain as she saw the tension rise, but at the same time, an inner fire ignited within her. She knew that her fight was becoming more important than ever. And then, as if on cue, one of the guards grabbed her arm. "You're leaving here, and I don't want to hear another word from you," he barked, his face contorted with anger. She felt panic rising in her, but remembered that she had support. "I'm not leaving until this is over," she replied, trying to break free from his grip. But the guard only squeezed her hand tighter, and at that moment she saw the other guards standing around her, looking at her with sullen faces. "You thought your money would protect you from our wrath? You are wrong," one of them said with a mocking expression on his face, and there was malice in his voice that made her tremble with fear. There were whispers behind her, and she turned to see some of the spectators starting to back away, as if afraid they would be caught up in the conflict as well. She felt a cold sweat start to run down her back. "Please stay close," she cried, knowing that every word mattered now. "We can't let them win." But the manager, still gloating, commented, "This is all a disgrace to our hotel. Do you think your presence here is some kind of benefit? You are just creating problems." "I'm the one causing the problems," she replied, her her voice shaking with emotion. "You're the one causing the problems with your racism and hatred. You think you can intimidate us because you have money and power?" The guard couldn't help but push her hard against the wall, and she felt her body hit the cold concrete. "Listen, I can't wait any longer. Get your hands off me," she screamed, trying to remain composed, even though she was shaking with rage and fear inside. But the manager, noticing her vulnerability, began to laugh. "That's it. That's exactly how you should behave. Look at her. All she can do is scream. If you had any pride, you would have left already." In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just a question of being right or wrong, it was a battle for her dignity. She raised her head, despite the humiliation and fear, and looked the manager straight in the eyes. "You think you can break me? You're wrong. I'm not alone." As if in response to her words, the crowd, at first confused and frightened, began to show its strength. "We are for you," one of the men shouted, and this created a chain reaction among the others. Each of them began to raise their voices, and at that moment, the excitement began to grow into determination. "Yes, this is not just her fight. This is our fight," said the woman with long hair, and her words echoed through the crowd. The woman knew it was now or never, and her resolve strengthened. But the manager wasn't ready to give in. "You don't like that I'm telling the truth? Get out of our hotel before I throw you out," he shouted, his face red with rage. The guards, watching the crowd, began to approach her. One of them whispered something in the ear of another, and she realized that their plan was to divide the people. "They'll try to separate us," she screamed, realizing that their unity was now vulnerable. "We must stick together." Finally, one of the guards stood up and, without holding back his anger, said, "You all have no right to be here. We don't want you here. Get up before it's too late." His words were full of hatred, and she felt the darkness he carried trying to fall on her shoulders. At this point, the manager looked at the crowd with a smirk. "Now you all see what happens when someone tries to break our rules. You are in for the disgrace." Her inner flame flared even stronger, and she decided not to just remain silent. "I am not a disgrace. I am a person, and you cannot destroy me." The crowd began to rise again, and excitement spread throughout them. People began to stand behind her, raising their fists in solidarity. "We are with you," they shouted, and the woman felt her fear begin to recede, giving way to determination. She knew this moment could be a turning point in their fight, but the humiliation she had felt still lingered. How could this happen in the 21st century, in a hotel that was considered one of the best in the city? She couldn't shake the thought that the world was still full of hatred. Despite this, she knew she couldn't give up. Her voice grew louder and more powerful as she said, "We're not leaving. We're here to fight. We're here to show that racism has no place in our society." And in that moment, as her words rang in the air, she saw people begin to move toward her, uniting, and her heart filled with hope. Despite all the humiliation, despite all the fear, she knew that this battle would be the beginning of something great, that they could change the world if they only spoke up. The situation in the hotel had reached a critical point. The guards, noticing the crowd gathered around the woman, began to exchange glances and clench their fists, as if waiting for a command. The woman felt the darkness and hatred radiating from them, but she knew she could not allow fear to take over. She raised her hands, calling for people to unite. "Look at this," she screamed, pointing at the guards. "These people are trying to intimidate us. They think they can control us just because we're different from them. This is simply unacceptable." Words full of passion and determination brought cheers from the crowd. "Yes, we are with you," people exclaimed, and their voices filled the space, creating an atmosphere of unity. But the manager, realizing that the situation was starting to get out of hand, stepped forward. His face was distorted with hatred. "You all must understand that your behavior is unacceptable. This hotel is a place for respected customers, not for the likes of you." His words stung, and the woman felt the anger flare up inside her again. "Who are you to determine who deserves respect? Your preconceived notions don't matter. We are all human beings, and we have a right to respect." The crowd cheered, and the woman felt her strength grow. "We must not be afraid to speak. We must be strong. Each of us deserves to be heard." But the guards began to approach, their figures looking menacing in the bright lights of the hotel. One of them, with an angry expression on his face, said, "If you do not disperse, I will be forced to use force." His threat hung in the air, like a dark shadow filling the space. The crowd froze and the tension became unbearable. The woman felt her heart pounding in her chest, but just at that moment, when fear was about to overtake her, she saw someone in the audience start to rise, his face full of determination. It was the same guy who had been filming everything on his phone. He stepped forward and said loudly, "We are all here to support her. We will not let you intimidate us." His words became a spark that ignited the flame. Others began to raise their voices, supporting him. "We will not leave. This is our fight." The manager, feeling that he was losing control, shouted again, "You have no right to be here. I will throw you all out." But the woman had enough determination. She turned to him, her voice full of anger. "You want to throw us out? You won't scare us. We're not here to leave. We're here to do something important." She noticed someone in the crowd start pointing at the guards, pointing out their aggressive behavior. "Look at them. They're acting like real vile villains. This is not okay." People started pointing at the guards, their anger becoming more and more obvious. The woman felt her fear drain away, leaving only determination. She knew they had to stick together. Suddenly, one of the guards, unable to bear the tension, stepped towards her. "How much longer are you going to talk? We're not listening to you," he said, grinning maliciously. She responded without holding back her emotions, "You may not listen, but it will not change the truth. We are here to show that hatred cannot defeat us." The crowd responded to her words, and their unity became apparent once again. "We are all against racism," they shouted in unison, and it created a wave of energy that filled the entire space. But the manager, noticing that the crowd's support was growing, became furious. He turned back to the security. "Stop talking. Call the police. Let them solve this problem." The woman felt her heart sink. She knew that the police often failed to protect those who were subjected to racism. This only made her fear worse, but she couldn't afford to back down. "I won't let this happen. It's not our fault what's happening here." As soon as the guards began to take steps towards the telephone, the crowd shouted again, "We will not leave. We are not afraid." The woman, raising her voice, exclaimed, "Let them come. We are not afraid. We will be here to fight for our rights." At that moment, there was a loud creaking and grinding sound as the hotel doors opened and several police officers walked in. Their stern faces and uniforms made many people afraid, but at the same time, the woman knew that this could be a turning point. "What's going on here?" one of the police officers asked, looking around the crowd. "Why are there so many people here?" The woman stepped forward. "We are here to fight racism. This hotel refuses to serve me just because of the color of my skin." The police looked at each other, and the woman felt the tension rise. "Do you realize you're causing trouble?" one of them said, his voice cold. "We need you all to leave." The crowd began to make noise, and the woman realized that everything would be decided at that moment. She turned to the people. Their faces were full of fear, but they also showed an unwavering desire to change the situation. "Look at us," she shouted, raising her hand. "We cannot retreat. We must fight for our rights." The people began to rise again, and among them there were cries of, "We are here for the truth. We are here for justice." The police, seeing the unity of the crowd, began to look confused. One of them, trying to maintain control, said, "If you all do not disperse, we will be forced to use force." The woman felt the tension peak, but this was her moment. "You think you can intimidate us? We've already tasted fear. We're ready to stand up for our rights." Despite the threats and danger, she realized that now, in this situation, every voice counts. This became her battle, and she knew she had to be strong. Finally, someone in the crowd began to raise a banner that read, "Justice for all," and her cry rang out again, "We will not leave. We demand to be respected." The police, looking around at the crowd, realized that the situation was becoming increasingly difficult. The hatred they saw was met with a determination and fighting spirit that was stronger than any threats. She looked into the eyes of the people around her and felt that they were all one force. She understood that the fight they were fighting was not just for her rights, but for the rights of everyone who had ever faced prejudice and hatred. It was a battle that had to be won, and she was ready to fight until the end. The situation in the hotel was heating up. The woman felt fear grip her heart, but she knew she couldn't back down. The police officers standing at the entrance looked at the crowd with distrust, as if each of them were potential criminals. Her voice, full of determination, pierced the tension. "We are here to fight for our rights, and you cannot intimidate us." But the manager, feeling his power slipping away, stepped forward again. "How much longer are you going to shout? You are nothing. We are a respected hotel, and you are all just a disgrace." His words sounded like an angry whisper aimed straight at the woman's soul. She felt the humiliation pressing down on her, but a spark of anger was flaring up inside. "You can't judge who we are by the color of our skin," she screamed, her voice shaking with emotion. "We are here to change that." As if in response to her words, one of the guards grabbed her arm again, squeezing so hard she felt her joints creak. "Get your hands off her," one of the men in the crowd shouted, and his words caused a wave of support. But the guards only chuckled, as if they found pleasure in her suffering. At this point, among the spectators, the woman noticed an elderly lady who, unable to bear the tension, began to cry. "Why is this happening? Why is this still possible in this day and age?" Her voice was full of hopelessness, and this made the woman feel her heart squeeze with pain. It became clear to her that the fight they were waging was not only about her, but about everyone who had ever suffered from racism. "We are all here for the truth," she said, trying to find strength. "We are not alone. We cannot afford to forget that we are human." The crowd started cheering for her, but the manager wasn't going to give in. "This isn't your war. This is my hotel. I can do anything to you." His voice sounded like he was ready to tear them to pieces. One of the police officers, noticing how the situation was escalating, raised his hand to calm the guards. "We don't want violence, but if any of you don't calm down, we'll have to intervene." "And what will you do?" the woman exclaimed. "Do you want to intimidate us? We have the right to speak." But at that moment, the guard, without holding back, pushed her, and she, losing her balance, fell to the floor. The whole world seemed to stop. The loud sound of her fall echoed off the walls, and she felt a strong wave of humiliation wash over her. Her hand hit the cold floor, and she instinctively pressed it to her chest, as if trying to protect herself from everything that was happening. The crowd erupted in outrage. "This is unacceptable," someone shouted. The woman looked up and saw that some people had started to cry, their faces reflecting shock and anger. Suddenly she felt herself losing hope. "Why do we have to put up with this? Why?" she cried, her voice full of bitterness and despair. "I can't believe this is still happening. We all deserve better." But the manager, feeling that his power was under threat, shouted, "Get her out. I don't want to see her here anymore." That was the last straw. One of the men standing in the crowd came closer. He was strong. His face was determined. "No, you can't just take her away. She has a right to be here, just like the rest of us. We won't leave until you take action against this racism." And at that moment, when the tension reached its peak, sirens were heard in the street. It was a sound that could mean anything, help or even more fear. The police, called by the manager, could mean not rescue, but even more danger. The woman felt her heart pounding. "Look, they've come," said one of the women in the crowd, her voice shaking with fear. "They might disperse us." But the woman on the floor felt that this struggle was not only her own. She began to rise, despite the pain, and saw how fear began to grip the people around her. "Don't be afraid," she cried. "We must stand together. This is our strength." The crowd began to rise again, but the guards, realizing that the people's support was growing, began to act more aggressively. They began to pull people out of the crowd, trying to break their unity. The woman felt her anger flare up again. "We won't let them tear us apart. We're together," she screamed, her voice a battle cry, but fear still lingered in her soul. The sirens grew louder and more people began to gather in the streets. Soon a squad of police appeared, their faces cold and indifferent. They looked at the crowd as a threat, and the woman realized that this could end badly. "Everyone move away," one of the policemen shouted, and his voice sounded like a bolt from the blue. The woman knew that this moment could be decisive. Her heart was pounding with fear, but she could not retreat. "We will not disperse until you take action against racism," she shouted, her voice confident even as fear and despair raged inside her. But the police began to advance toward the crowd, their faces unreadable. "You will all be detained if you do not leave now," one of them shouted again. And at that moment, panic broke out among the crowd. People began to run away, realizing that the situation was becoming dangerous. The woman felt her heart squeeze with fear. She watched as people who had just been full of determination now ran in different directions, leaving her alone. At that moment, she felt the world around her begin to crumble. Her eyes filled with tears as she realized that the fight they were waging might not be successful. Why is it so hard?" she thought out loud, her voice bitter. Can't we just be human? But just when she was about to give up, one person left in the crowd turned to her. It was the same guy who had been filming everything on his phone. He came closer, his eyes full of support. "You were strong," he said, his voice quiet but confident. "You inspired us all. We won't forget that. I promise." The woman raised her head, and the flame of hope ignited in her soul again. "Yes, we cannot give up. This is not just my fight, this is our fight." Despite her fear, she took a step forward. Her voice became loud and confident again. "We will not leave until we see changes. We will fight." The crowd, though disorganized and scattered, began to gather around her again, finding comfort and support in her words. Each of them understood that this was their moment, their battle, and they were ready to continue the fight for their rights, despite all the difficulties and fears that surrounded them. And at that moment, as the police continued to approach, the woman realized that their unity was their most powerful weapon. She turned to the guards and manager, her voice a loud challenge. "You can't break us. We'll be here until you change your attitude." It was the beginning of a new fight, and every person in the crowd knew they had to stand together, no matter what the odds. It wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for the entire society to end hatred and prejudice once and for all. The crowd, though disorganized, continued to gather around the woman. Their unity and determination began to grow again, but the hotel manager, realizing that the situation was getting out of control, stepped forward and, looking at the police, said, "This is private property. Get out." The manager's words came as a bolt from the blue. The woman felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked in horror, not believing that this was actually happening. "You all have to leave," the manager shouted, his voice like a sentence. "This hotel is not for you." The police looked at each other and started moving towards the crowd. One of the policemen, his face impassive, said, "We can't let you disturb the peace. You need to disperse or you will all be detained." The woman felt the ground slipping away from under her feet. Everyone who had supported her now became the object of hatred and aggression. People around her began to whisper, expressing bewilderment and fear. "But we did nothing wrong," someone from the crowd exclaimed. One of the policemen clutched the handcuffs, ready to act. He looked at the woman with an arrogant expression. "You have no right to be here. This hotel is private property, and you can't just stand here and cause trouble." The woman felt anger and despair merging. She looked at the people around her, their faces full of anxiety and uncertainty. In that moment, she realized that she could not allow herself to break down. "We have a right to be here. We are not criminals. We just want respect." But the manager, not wanting to listen to her words, continued, "You must all leave. Otherwise we will be forced to call in additional forces to remove you." The crowd began to get nervous. "Let's just leave," one of the women said, her voice shaking with fear. "It's not worth it." But others began to protest. "No, we can't just leave. We have to fight." Yet fear began to overtake her resolve. The woman felt her hope begin to fade. She knew that this fight was not only her own, but that of everyone around her. But now, with the police closing in on her, she realized that her voice might not matter. Gradually, under the pressure of threats and intimidation, people began to disperse. Someone in the crowd, deciding that he did not want to run into the police, quietly left. "I don't want anything to do with this," he said, moving away. "They might arrest us." The woman felt her heart squeeze with bitterness. "Don't go! We can't give up!" she screamed, but her words were drowned out by the noise. People, one by one, began to leave the scene of the clash, until finally only a small group of brave souls remained, who continued to stand next to her. Finally, the manager, realizing that many had already fled, shouted, "You must all leave. And now, this is my property, and I am not going to allow you to be here." The remaining people began to look at each other, not knowing what to do. They felt fear squeezing their hearts. Finally, one of the men, deciding that it was not worth taking any more risks, stepped back and said, "I can't stay here any longer. I'm sorry, I'm leaving." The woman felt her world crumble. She watched as one by one people abandoned her, leaving her alone with the administration, the police and the guards. At that moment, she felt like she was losing the fight. When the last of her supporters left, the woman was left alone, surrounded by guards and police. "You are all leaving this place," one of the guards said, his voice full of anger. "You are not welcome here, and if you do not leave, we will be forced to use force." as if in response to his threat. The woman stood up straight and looked at him. "You can't intimidate us. We are people. We have rights." But her words were drowned out by the manager's anger. "Get out of my hotel. If you don't come out, I'll call the police." With these words, the woman, feeling helpless, took a step back. She knew that she could no longer continue the fight alone. "I'm leaving, but this is not the end," she said, trying to maintain her dignity. Once outside, she felt the cold air burning her skin, but that wasn't the hardest part. She realized that all her struggle had been in vain. The hotel, which was supposed to be a place of comfort and coziness, had become a symbol of hatred and prejudice. As she walked away, the guards giggled behind her, and her heart sank with humiliation. How could she have imagined that in a modern world so full of progress, such terrible racism still existed? Tears gathered in her eyes, and she knew that this night would forever remain etched in her memory as the moment when she had confronted the cruelty of the world at its very heart. The woman, feeling lost and humiliated, took a step back, realizing that her voice, filled with determination, was powerless against the cruelty that surrounded her. The guards standing guard at the entrance had already begun to move closer, and there was not a drop of understanding or compassion in their eyes. "You don't belong here," one of them shouted, pushing her towards the exit. "You must leave and never come back." She felt anger mixing with hopelessness. "I just want to be heard. You can't treat me like this," she said, but her words, as before, disappeared into the void. Without waiting for an answer, the guard pushed her from behind, and she lost her balance and found herself outside the hotel. The silence of the street was deafening as the door slammed shut behind her. Her heart pounded with betrayal and humiliation. She would never be able to cross that threshold again, no matter what she had done or how much money she had. Voices were heard around her, and she saw everyone who had supported her slowly disperse as well. Their faces were full of confusion and fear, but now they could no longer stay close, under the risk of being detained or worse, subjected to violence. She felt her heart squeeze with pain as they left, leaving her alone with this humiliation. "What do I do now?" she whispered, looking at the doors that would never open for her again. She took a step back, feeling the whole world squeeze in her chest. She couldn't believe that the world she lived in was still filled with hatred and prejudice. As she stood on the street, her thoughts raced, trying to find an answer. What happened to those who were with me? Why didn't they stay? Her inner voice screamed in pain, and although she knew they did what they thought was right, it hurt her to realize that their courage was not enough to stand up to this terrible system. And what had happened to the manager and the security? Unfortunately, the answer was as unclear as everything else that had happened around her. She imagined them, back at the hotel, gathering back into their cozy surroundings, laughing about the incident as if it were a joke and not the vile display of racism that she had felt so vividly. "They'll probably never understand what they did," she thought, and tears came to her eyes. She couldn't imagine that they didn't have the conscience to realize that they were part of this horror. With nowhere to go, she continued to stand on the sidewalk, looking at the hotel door where all her dreams and hopes had been left behind. This moment became a lesson for her, a lesson that the world is not always fair, and sometimes, even if you have all the resources, you can still face hatred and prejudice. And so, the woman slowly turned and walked down the street, her heart broken and her soul full of anger. She didn't know what would happen next. She just knew one thing: she had to find a way to continue her fight despite this humiliating setback. This was not the end, but only the beginning of her journey, which might lead to something greater than she could have ever imagined. But what will happen to the racists who run this hotel? Unfortunately, we will never know. In this world, sometimes the truth remains hidden, and only time will reveal new chapters of the story. As the woman walked through the empty streets, she felt her anger begin to turn into determination. This humiliation she had suffered could not go unpunished. She knew that if she did not take action, incidents like this would continue and no one would talk about them. She spent a few days gathering her thoughts and strength, deciding that she couldn't remain silent any longer. She took her story into her hands, not just her own, but the stories of everyone who had ever experienced racism and bias. She began writing articles, emphasizing that even the richest and most successful can face discrimination. She used her platform to talk about her struggles and the importance of fighting this evil. Her story gained more and more attention with each passing day. It became a topic of discussion on social media, attracting activists and journalists ready to support her. Many people began to take to the streets, demanding justice and equality, condemning racism and discrimination in any form. Ultimately, the story of a woman rejected by a racist hotel became a symbol of the fight for rights and dignity. The government and local authorities could not ignore public anger, and as a result, investigations were launched against the hotel managers. Although the exact outcome was unknown, her voice, like so many others, was heard loud and clear. She realized that even one humiliation could be a catalyst for change, that her story could inspire others to fight for their rights. The woman looked at herself in the mirror and realized that although she could no longer enter that hotel, she had found her place in the fight for justice. Her spirit was unbroken, and she would continue to move forward, opening doors for others so that no one would have to suffer such humiliation again. With this determination in her heart, she stepped into a new world, a world where racism and prejudice would not go unpunished. This was not only her story, but the story of all those who dared to speak up and demand change. And although she still had many challenges ahead of her, she knew one thing: she was no longer alone. So the story of the racist hotel and its managers may not have ended the way she wanted, but it was just beginning, and in that beginning lay hope. Thank you for watching our story. We would like to know what you think about this story. Have you ever experienced racism in your life that has left a mark on your soul? It is very important for us to hear your thoughts and opinions, so feel free to share them in the comments. You are an integral part of our channel, and we value each of you. Your likes and subscriptions help us develop and make even more interesting content. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you enjoyed the video. Have a great day and hope to see you again.